want to check if anyone in Zoom can hear me okay. Can you give me like a thumbs up or say something in the chat box?
Bu Roro, suaranya nggak clear. Your voice not so clear.
So that I have to. Okay. You mind?
Oh, so sorry. Sorry.
It's yeah, I know. Okay, what about now? What about now?
Clear, loud and clear.
Clear, Bu. Okay. Thank you.
Good. So I have to use two mics here. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome to our next guest lecture series, 2022. This is a collaboration between School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development of ITB and School of Architecture, Building and Planning, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, the University of Melbourne. Sorry. So today we will have Julie Willis. Hi, Julie. She's the Dean of ABP, or we usually call it MSD. And she will talk about why do architects need to learn history. And before I start, I will read a brief bio of Julie. Julie Willis is a professor of architecture and dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. She is an authority of the history of architecture, Australian architecture, 1890 to 1950, and has undertaken significant projects researching the development of modern hospital architecture in Australia. Her current research includes writing a new short history of Australian architecture, the transmission and translation of architectural knowledge through professional network in architecture, and the design of hospitals and their positive effects on patient well-being. I think before I start, I would like to invite all of you, if you have any question, we can discuss it in the Q&A session after the lecture. And also if anyone in the Zoom have question, you can drop the question in the chat box, or else you can raise your hand after the lecture so that we can have a direct conversation with Julie. So without further ado, I would like to invite Julie to the stage.
Okay.
Flip it here.
Yeah. Selamat pagi. Thank you so much for having me here again at ITB. I'm very pleased to be here and to be able to speak with you today. Ibu Roro, I'm very, very grateful for your excellent hosting. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I'm here to talk to you about one of my favourite topics, which is architectural history. I have some slides and we are sharing. If we can have the first one, that just gives us. We go to slideshow, thank you. And then we can move to the next slide. So the question is, why do architects need to learn history, and what impact does that have for contemporary design? Well, I'm somewhat biased. I'm fully trained as an architect, but I'm also an architectural historian. And I find looking at architecture and architects of the past a really good way of informing how I think about design and architecture and how I think about problem solving in a contemporary setting. But what I'm going to do is do a little bit of history, which seems appropriate, going back and looking at why people were looking at history earlier on. I have here Albert Logier's concept of the primitive hut. And this is the idea that architecture is somehow a universal truth, that we all seek shelter and that we seek shelter using standard construction, ways of construction. And this is a series of posts and then a roof created over the top. The idea there's somehow an essential hut that we all want to live in. And from that, and if you can see the detail just underneath the lady who's pointing, is classical architecture, the idea that there is this connection through from early ideas, ancient ideas about shelter for humans, through to high-end architecture and sophisticated ideas of decoration. Can I have the next slide, please? Architecture of the past can inspire us. We look at it and we are in awe. We think that it tells us things, but when we look at something like Borobudur, we think this is an amazing construction. But there are things in this that are very powerful and universal. Buildings that are to inspire awe or to celebrate gods are often built up high. They require mere mortals, us people, to climb up towards heaven. And this is a very deliberate design decision. It is to make us feel small. It is to make us feel as though God above is wonderful and we are just a mere mortal. Almost all religious buildings have these characteristics that encourage the people who go into them to feel in a certain way. So while we are inspired and in awe, the builders and designers of these places meant us to be in awe of them. Can I have the next slide, please? Even a building like the Parthenon sitting atop the Acropolis is meant to encourage that idea that you must travel to this, that this is a special and a sacred place. And you, as you can see, the size of the people standing around it are very, very small in comparison to this enormous building. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm going to confess, I couldn't decide between the Blue Mosque and Hagia Sophia, so I have both. And when you go into a building like the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, you are absolutely overwhelmed by the space, by the sense of contemplation. You need to be silent. You need to think about your connection to God. And the architecture is deliberately designed to do that. Can I have the next slide? I said I had the Hagia Sophia, so here I have it. These buildings are simply extraordinary to go into. The sense of the past over a very long period of time. If you've been to the Hagia Sophia, they often point out that there is graffiti scored into the stone from Vikings, which gives you an idea of how old this building is and how extraordinary it was that it was built. And these soaring internal spaces, next slides, please, are also seen in the Gothic cathedrals of Europe. If I remember correctly, this is Lincoln Cathedral, which again meant to encourage you to think that you are small and that the extraordinary decoration and the sacrifice that is made to a higher power. So architecture can do a lot in terms of inspiring us. Next slide, please. It's not just ancient architecture that does this. Something like the Sydney Opera House is an extraordinary feat of architecture and is also very inspiring, but very different in its architectural response. Some of the things that we're talking about here, the universal principles about scale, about approach, the way somebody interacts with a building, the way the quality of the atmosphere that is created is what makes these amazing pieces of architecture, that you have an emotional response to them. And so you can find this in any piece of architecture. And so looking to the past allows us to think about these qualities of architecture and to be able to think about putting them into contemporary design. Next slide, please. There are various times in which humans look at different eras of the past to find inspiration. In the 1920s, looking to Egypt was very popular as different archaeological digs uncovered new treasures of the Egyptian pharaohs and their extraordinary exploits. Next slide, please. But at that time, architecture, the way to design, was taught almost entirely as an appreciation of the past, of history. It was unusual, if not unheard of, in the 1920s to have subjects that were dedicated to design only. They generally were subjects that were looking at history. And students like this one, this is J.D. Moore at the Architectural Association in London, is looking to the past, Egypt in this case, to design something new. And so students were encouraged to analyse past buildings to understand the qualities of them that made good design: proportion, decoration, materials, approach, balance. In this case, at this time, symmetry was very important. And so we used again and again to think about how architecture of the future, contemporary architecture, could be conceived of. Sorry, it's a bit awkward holding the two microphones. I'm doing my best. No, it's okay. Next slide, please. So the past is also thought about as a cure for the future. And I go back in time because this is a drawing from the 1830s. This is A.W.N. Pugin's Contrasts. And Pugin was an architect and a prolific author. And he wanted to prove that the past could have the answers for the future. What he's comparing here, and you can see if you can read it, it says contrasted residences for the poor. And on the left-hand side is the current residence for the poor. And on the right-hand side is the medieval residence for the poor. And what he is saying is that modern architecture encourages crime. Old architecture encourages community, and it has less crime and less corruption. If you know anything about medieval history, this is not true, but he was putting a case for that the Gothic architecture would be the cure for social evils. And so you had to reject architecture of that time and embrace architecture of the past to create new societies. And Gothic architecture, the Gothic revival, became a really strong thing in the 19th century. And what we see is this association of architecture of the past with the qualities that were ascribed or given to them. If we think back to the Parthenon, the qualities of that building were considered to be democracy and participation. And so you often found in the 19th century different styles being used to create different ideas. That was hopefully how people were going to respond to those buildings. Next slide, please. So looking back at the past, and I'm choosing some pages here from Sir Bannister Fletcher's History of Architecture Comparative Method. And I'm well aware how difficult this book is. And so I'm not endorsing it as a great example. But it looked to the past to inform contemporary architecture in different ways. On the far left-hand side, you can see it says principles of proportion, and it's looking at both classical and Gothic buildings to talk about what are the beautiful proportions that students should be emulating. On the right-hand side is looking at the series, it says the Byzantine system of construction, looking at the technical requirements for the building of domes. And there were all sorts of different construction techniques that were brought into this, this tome, which of course has recently been entirely rewritten. So looking to the past is not just about inspiring awe, it's also about finding different ways of thinking about what buildings create in terms of behaviours and expectations. It's also about systems of beauty and ideas of beauty and ways of constructing things. So the past has many lessons for us. Can I have the next slide, please? Forgive me, my iPad keeps going to sleep and then I lose my place and I need to look at it again. So the idea of precedence, architecture of the past inspiring architecture of the present, was very, very prevalent throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. You'll have to forgive me, I've chosen some examples that I'm very familiar with. So some of them come from Melbourne. This one is the Flinders Street Station, a railway station in Melbourne, built between 1901 and 1910. And this building draws on precedent. It looks very much towards the classical. It has a lot of Baroque overtones to it. And it chooses those overtones deliberately because in 1901, Australia federated from the 6 colonies that it had been into a single nation. And this was the railway station through which all the new parliamentarians, members of parliament, passed through to sit in the first federal parliament. This building was seen as a gateway and an expression of power and allegiance. And that power and allegiance was back to Britain and to London and used architecture that was consciously imperial in nature. It wasn't about an Australian architecture. It was about an affiliation in a sort of the British Empire, and we would find the same architecture appearing in other like places around the world. So architecture can also convey political power through its design, and this one deliberately choosing certain styles of the past to make that affiliation clear. Next slide, please. But then came the modern movement, which said the architecture of the past is not useful and decoration is immoral, and we need to look to the elements of building, the essence of it, the truth of building and architecture and design. And we can design things that will be applicable to every person. So we're looking here at design by Le Corbusier in Paris, and you can see the very clean lines of the buildings. There's no decoration. There's no references to the past built into the building, obviously. But there are references to the past in this work. Le Corbusier was very interested in the architecture around around North Africa. And so he looked at buildings that were for very hot climates, their plain surfaces, their flat roofs, and was very inspired by them. There are sketches that he made that are like these. And so this building does not have, it's not free from connections to the past. And it's built on proportional systems that he had looked at through mathematical derivations that were also present in buildings of the past. So it's not quite as free from history as you might think. Can we have the next slide, please? Even his later work here at Chandigarh, we see this large buildings created from off-form concrete, designed for a very hot climate with deep reveals so there'd be shading, very muscular architecture, also apparently not connected to the past. But if we look at what Le Corbusier is looking at that period of time, we can have the next slide, please. The buildings that were created during the Second World War in France that were defensive buildings are certainly things that will have inspired him to think about the textural effects of form concrete. So we can see here submarine base at Bordeaux on the right and a gun tower and lands on the left. And if you look at the details of Corbusier's later works, they bear very strong resemblances to some of these examples that were built, say, 10 years before. Next slide, please. But then we have postmodernism, which was a rejection of modernism. And this starts in the late 1960s and into the 1970s. I'm showing you a building in Melbourne from the 1990s. It was colourful. It referenced the past. It chose things from the past and played with them and made them fun. And it didn't reject the past. It reimagined the past. Now, I'm not going to go through all the references in this building because many of them are very Australian references, such as the colours of different football teams and references to contemporary culture, such as the singer Madonna. But it also has historical references all the way through the building. Next slide, please. So why would I show you a building by Alberti in Italy from the 16th century? Well, what we're looking at is a building type, and you're going to have to bear with me, but I'm going to connect this building to the work of Mies van der Rohe and say this is a connection and a line of inspiration that becomes really revolutionary in the way we think about architecture, all referencing back to buildings that have already been constructed. What this is a palazzo, a palace that is a particular type of composition design. It has a base to it, which is rusticated. That's the rough stonework you can see. It has what's called a piano nobile, which is the next floor up, which is, it will translate as the sort of nobleman's floor. And then it has an attic story at the top. This happens to have 2 stories in its section that we would call the piano nobile, and then the attic under a heavy cornice at the top. A base, a middle, a top. If we can have the next slide, please. That becomes inspirational for many 19th century buildings. So this is the Treasury building in Melbourne that uses the same formula, a base, and you can see the articulation of the columns in the front, which is also called rustication, but this is not the really rough stonework, a piano nobile floor, and then an attic story under that heavy cornice. The same palazzo used as an inspiration. In Australia, you would see many banks that are built in this way, many, many buildings used again and again, a very successful model. Could I have the next slide, please? The same idea is used by architects in the United States to conceive of how you could design a skyscraper building. Now, what you can see is the heavy cornice at the top of the building. And just below it, a decorative strip that is effectively the attic story. At the base, you see a clear articulation of that, and it looks massive, heavy. And in between, you have effectively a piano nobile, which is repeating over and over and over again, stretching out. Louis Sullivan, one of the architects doing these kinds of the work, it's his building in the middle there, used the analogy of a column with a base, a shaft, and a capital, but this is also coming from the palazzo with its base, piano nobile, and attic story. Can I have the next slide, please? And when Mies van der Rohe imagines his glass architecture in the Friedrichstrasse in 1919, he is drawing on those skyscraper ideas and imagining the skyscraper now lifting into the sky, but it still has a clear edge to the top of it. What he doesn't have is that articulated base, but it is the buildings that have come before that lead towards something like this, that really reconceptualizes how we can think about a skyscraper. But it could not have happened without those earlier articulations. And so we see a thread coming through and history having an impact on some of the icons of the modern movement. Can we have the next slide, please? Traditional architectures like this, I believe this is a Sundanese temple, and that are ways of living and dwelling in a community that have been around for thousands of years, can be just as inspirational. Can I have the next slide, please? Although it is not a direct connection, we see works like the Sri Lankan architect Geoffrey Bower reinterpreting traditional architectures to create modern buildings. If you're looking at this as architectural historiography, you would be calling this critical regionalism as the style. But it's not, that's not really a style, that's an approach. But looking to the past to create modern buildings. Can I have the next slide, please? But traditional buildings also influence works like this. This is a design for a house in Darwin in Australia by the architect Benica Glyn Burnett. And Burnett was born in Mongolia and then worked in Singapore and Malaysia before coming to Australia to design houses that needed to be responsive to climate. And so he looked back to the traditional architecture that he had seen in the places that he had worked and took the lessons from that to build new buildings, ones that were working well in the climate instead of trying to deny the climate. And so we see a connection through from traditional architecture from a very different place to Darwin being reimagined as an appropriate modern architecture for its new home. Can I have the next slide, please? In Australia, we have vernacular architecture, architecture that is of the place, architecture that is designed through need. This is a shearing shed. They look very similar all across Australia. They use corrugated iron, they use rough timber posts. I actually own a building very similar to this. And they are just part of the landscape. They are built because they are from need, but they are also inspiring to architects now. If we look at the next slide, please. This is a design by Glenn Murcutt, the very famous Australian architect, the Marie Short House in Kempsey. And what you can see are the connections back to those shearing sheds, the interest in the roof form as the dominant feature of the building. But he's also drawing an inspiration from buildings that are open to the elements. We can see the use of louvers through here.
Baru semua ini.
Yeah. That's okay.
Dulu sudah dibabat semua. Apa? Bukan.
So a building like this has been inspired by multiple buildings from the past to recreate it into very modern architecture. Can I have the next slide, please? Architecture from the past can inspire all sorts of different buildings. This one is the Brambrook Cultural Centre, designed for an Australian Indigenous community, and it looks very much to the past and the building traditions of that community to reimagine a space for them in contemporary design, using contemporary materials, the corrugated iron, but also traditional materials such as the untreated timber posts that hold up the roof frame there. It becomes an architecture that is of its place, but it's drawing from vernacular architectures that are of its place as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So I want to just spend a little bit of time on this building. This is the Queensland Treasury Building in Brisbane. So why would I show a building like this? This looks like a traditional classical building imported to Australia, inspired by Renaissance architecture in Italy, that has made its way as inspiration through England and on to Australia. And many people have looked at this building and gone, it's not appropriate for the hot climate in Brisbane, which is subtropical, and so has quite a lot of humidity all the time. Inside this building are fireplaces, and it has been laughed at because you don't need to have heating in Brisbane. What that assumes is that architects didn't know what they were doing. If we look at this building more closely, what we see is that it uses the structural frames that are part of the building to create deep shadows for the windows so they are shaded. It also uses arcaded loggias. So would the students know what an arcaded loggia is? Possibly not. It's like a walkway that is covered in as part of the building. Arcade, okay. So it has arcades sitting in there. Now, let me go back to those fireplaces. In every door to every room, there is a vent put in the base of the door. The fireplaces are not to heat. They are thermal chimneys to take the air out. They are a ventilation system in the building, a natural ventilation system, using a traditional form that would be recognisable to the people occupying the building. And they'd be going, why do I need a fireplace? Not realising that if you can create that thermal chimney, you will successfully ventilate the building in a hot climate. The architect knew exactly what they were doing. They were not stupid. They knew. And so this building is a really responsive building to its climate, but it is a building that looks to the past in strange ways. Excuse me. And so I find it a really fascinating example of how architecture from the past can tell us things, but it can also tell us that we make assumptions about architects, that they somehow were naive or stupid or didn't know. And that's usually not the case. Can I have the next slide, please? So we also have architectures that indicate difficult pasts. In my country, in your country, colonialism is a difficult past. And it's one that we, I think, at least in my country, we struggle with, and how to think about this. And I know these buildings are celebrated, but I know they must be difficult at the same time. But if we look to the past and we understand that difficulty, we can reimagine what the future will be, because the past is gone and the future is something new. But we can still appropriate and use these buildings and own that past and remember that past. In Indigenous Australia, they talk about needing to reconcile the past, and that you do not reject the history, Because if you reject it, you hide it and you pretend it didn't happen and you do not own it. But if you do own it and you explain the hurt, the pain, the violence, the difficulties, you will understand it more, you will remember, and you will not do it again. And so understanding history and the past is really very important to even celebrate it, to keep that memory alive. And we make buildings for memory all of the time. We go to the next slide, please. This too is a difficult past, a building of difficult past, but one that suggests a future for me, at least. Modern architecture was very much about looking towards the future. And so it's interesting to me that we can celebrate and dislike and find architectures of the past useful, horrible, challenging, different, all of those kinds of things at the same time. We do not need to reconcile these. What we need to do is understand them and be inspired by what we need to be inspired by. We can and do build on the past in everything that we do. We remember, we gain experience, we gain knowledge. The past is a reminder that there is much to learn by looking back, but it informs our future by inspiring, by giving us forms to look at, architectural languages with which to experiment. It gives us ideas. It can also tell us what not to do, when it is bad, and when it is difficult, and when it is not functional. It can tell us what not to do. So architecture from the past is an essential part of our learning and the way we need to think about things. It does not mean we copy the past. We are inspired by it. We allow it to inform our thinking one way or another. We need to be inspired by it because architects and designers and builders of the past knew what they were doing. They have made clever solutions to things like climate responsive buildings, buildings that are sustainable, buildings that will return to the earth when they are done, buildings that contain memories, buildings that influence our behaviour in positive ways. They know what they were doing and they have left legacies for us to be inspired by. And so I find the past endlessly interesting and exciting. And I don't just look at buildings, I also try and get inside the mind of the architect, how they were thinking at that time, why they made those choices, what they were inspired by. And by thinking in that way, I am always looking to why they chose that solution. Why was that the best answer at that particular time? And it may be because of the availability of expertise or materials or what the culture was at that point in time. But it makes me a better architect because I think more about what I am doing and I think about the culture that I am designing for. I think about the materials. I think about the impact. I think about what the outcomes will be. I think about the way I want people to experience buildings. All of those I learn from looking at history and the past. And very important, because history in the books is so dominated by the centers of culture, Western culture, the US, Europe, the UK. I don't come from a place which is the center of culture. I need to look more widely for what my inspiration is. We don't have to look at what the books tell us is history. We can look at anything and see the history in it. And that is really important to understand. That doesn't mean you can't get inspired by buildings completely outside of your culture, but You still need to understand your culture and your history and the history of place and the built history that represents that place. So for me, architectural history is an essential way of understanding design and how it inflects, changes, and creates new ideas going forward in contemporary design. I think I'm going to leave it there. I always speak too short. I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's all right.
I'm looking forward to the discussion, though. I think that will be important.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie, for the lecture. Can we have applause here? Yeah, very interesting and engaging presentation. Also not provoking. I believe we have oh yeah. I believe we have discussion. Do we have any question in chat box? Not yet. So I offer here if any of you want to ask question. If not, then probably I can ask you first. I have a lot of questions here. So you mentioned that we can actually refer to probably from the past the proportion or something that they have done right, and then bring the idea to the contemporary side of what is happening now. But then how do we know that that kind of proportion is still makes sense for our context, or how do we kind of like separate which one we can follow and which one is not, and this is obsolete kind of thing, and that is not? Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's my question.
Look, I think in architecture schools, we don't teach enough about scale and proportion anymore. So it used to be foundational to the curriculum. I certainly didn't learn about it. But it is interesting that if you do analyse buildings from all sorts of different places, they do have quite similar proportions. So humans do find the scale and proportion of some spaces to be more pleasing than others. But scale and proportion in more detail can tell you a little bit about fashion too, because they change depending on the shape and size of doors and windows. And sometimes people will find one more pleasing than the other. And subtle changes to that can create something that looks fresh and new. So I don't know that they're ever obsolete, but they help us think about how we can do what seem like little changes, but really change the feel of a building and a design. And so thinking about that gives you more control over design, more choice, instead of, oh, the catalogue says the door's that size, I'll choose that. That means that everything looks the same and you won't get the changes that you need to see. There's a really good example of how proportion can change the whole way architecture is looked at. So if you look at Frank Lloyd Wright's Winslow House in, it's either River Forest or the other one, 1893. In the late 19th century, proportions were very vertical, and it's quite at what I would call Victorian proportions, where it's about twice the height compared to the width, very common. Frank Lloyd Wright changes that proportion. He widens them out and drops the height so that the height to width ratio is much squarer, but it's almost a horizontally laid rectangle. He changes the way you look at architecture immediately. And it's so early, 1893, if I put a series of buildings for you up of 1893, you go, yeah, what? Like this. So, it is simply about proportion. If he had the sort of normal or the ordinary proportion of that period of time, it would not be this revolutionary building at all. But it really is this sort of like a lightning strike, and it is just changing the proportions. Sorry, I got a bit carried away.
Yeah. Okay, so you mean that reference to the past, not only we can copy it, but we can also kind of predict or just to post it or Okay. All right.
Yes, you can critique it and juxtapose it and do different things to it. That's part of the creative process. You're taking inspiration. It doesn't mean it was right, but it gives you different ways of thinking. I like looking at those really amazing moments and seeing how just something simple seemed to sort of ripple through a set of ideas and change the way a whole lot of people looked at something. You see, if you can do that as an architect, isn't that what we're all aiming for? Is fame and excitement about our work. So thinking about how you can be different or create an effect is really important.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. I think I have one person here in the Zoom that is raising hand. Ibu Indah, can you probably unmute yourself and start to ask?
Yes. Can you listen to me? My voice.
We can
can you hear me?
Clearly. Wait. Always problem with technicality here when we try to do hybrid things.
Okay.
Hold on.
Can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yes, we can actually hear you, but it's not clear. I think we are still dealing with the.
I will just type then. I will type in the chat box.
We can hear you okay now.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, you write it. Okay. Yeah, I'm so
I think I better write it so that.
we tested earlier and it was okay, but I don't know.
Technology.
Okay. I invite other than while waiting for Ibu Indah to write down the question, I still invite anyone here. Oh, probably from the student first. Probably just repeat.
I can repeat the question.
Okay. So you mentioned about my name is Yan, and I want to ask you something about you mentioned that we both actually get new idea of beauty, right? And in the presentation, you say that like there is like guideline to beauty, like the proportional in fashion, right? And it makes me wonder, actually, what will our idea of beauty? Is it a history or something that we used to, or is it actually instinctual or natural thing from us?
Okay.
And it's actually with certain way of when we feel certain way when I think that's all.
Okay.
At the moment.
So for those online, the question was about systems of beauty, and did the past give us, does that where we find systems and ideas of beauty, or can we reinvent them and have new ones?
Instinctual, or is it something that's influenced?
Yeah, is it instinctive or coming from the past? It is both. So there are many books that talk about ideas of beauty, ideals of beauty that you can look at, and you can appreciate yourself things that you see that are beautiful, and sometimes they are systems of proportion that are very carefully thought about. But there are always new ideas about beauty and spaces that are inspiring. So they don't need to come only from the past. There will be new ones that are invented through different ways of getting to that end point. So you shouldn't think that the past has all of the answers, but it has. Many people have tried things in the past. And so you may look back and see an experiment and go, well, I don't like what they did, but I can see what I should do. And I will take some of their ideas and I will do something new. The concept of beauty is always being reinvented. You only need to look at clothes fashion and the idea of beauty that we see through fashion, and that we choose new things. We like, oh, I like that shoe. Oh, I like that scarf. Oh, that's a lovely color. Our idea of beauty changes over time. You don't wear what you wore 20 years ago. Well, for many of you, you would have been too small. For me, I don't wear what I wore 20 years ago because my taste has changed over time. But there are things in architecture that we take inspiration from nature all the time in architecture, as we should, because nature is amazing, and constantly we are discovering more. But there are also things in the past that as I said earlier, sort of universal, things that will make you feel particular ways. Even the temperature of a building can make you feel happy or afraid. If the building is very cold and the surfaces are very harsh and dark, you may feel scared. If they are happy colors, and happy colors are different in different cultures. So what would be a happy color here? Yellow. Yellow is a happy color. If it's yellow and it is warm and comfortable, not too hot, comfortable. The surfaces are responsive, they're timbers, maybe they are textiles. This will be a happier place, warm, comfortable, inviting place. Proportion can do this too. If the ceiling is very low, you'll feel like this. The ceiling is very high. You will look up in wonder and go, oh, how amazing this space is. The higher it is, the smaller you will feel and the more in awe. Even the use of steps. If you have to go up steps, you will change your behavior as you go up steps. Not a stairway, but a big set of processional steps in front of a building. You will change. You will be meeker, more quiet going up those steps. So ideas come from everywhere, and ideas of beauty come from everywhere. But the past has lots to tell us.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. I think I have to go. Okay, I have to go with Ibu Indah first in the question in the chat box, because she raised hand first. So let me read it. Thank you for the insight, Prof. Julie. I wonder how is it to invoke the will to learn or appreciate history, especially in engineering school, because most cases I know people disregard history due to its being past with its connotation of not using advanced technology. What encouragement should we give to us to consider history as how to learn architecture?
Okay, that goes back to my earlier point. If you think that the past has nothing to tell you about innovation, you are kidding yourself. Because the innovation that is shown in building, construction, big infrastructures of the past are just extraordinary. And they often did it better than we can do it. There's a saying, if we don't take, I'm paraphrasing, if we don't take notice of the past, we are condemned to repeat it. And so what you will find is someone saying, I have a fantastic idea. I think for our transportation, what we need is an axle and a round thing on it. And we will have a wheel. I'll call it a wheel. We have these technological advancements that come through, and they are often built on ideas of the past. So if you do not look back, you will not find your inspiration. I'm going to use examples from medical science. And so sometimes people come up with crazy ideas in medical science and they are completely rejected at the time. Then they turn out to be right. So I can't remember I won't remember all the details, but there was a woman scientist who proposed that a particular cell was the combination of a bacteria and a plant. And everyone went, "You're crazy." She turned out to be right. And of course, then you can create therapeutics, medicines based on, if you are right about how the biological thing is working, you can actually then work with it to make the appropriate changes. But she just came up with this idea and everyone thought she was wrong. But it only takes someone looking back into the past going, hang on a second, no, she is right. And I like it that it's a she. She is right. And we need to think about that. So as humans, we are good at having ideas. But what we're also good at is assuming that other people don't have them. So I find it disrespectful to not think about the past and not give credit to those ideas and not use them as inspirations for innovations in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. That's the answer for Ibu Indah. Now we move to, okay, probably we can, okay. There you go. I'm so sorry about this technology hiccup. Probably we can go next to the question in Zoom. Interesting presentation, but I'm curious. Architecture keeps evolving. I have a question: in how many years should we use historical references that allow us to think for inspiration? That's for Rijaluddin.
I think you look for inspiration wherever you need it. That means that you can use it, not use it. I don't think there are a set number of years that you go and look back for inspiration. I think that you explore, you imagine, visit, see, think, and inspiration can come from any place and any time. Sometimes history can seem boring. If you are doing boring history, then you're not getting inspired by it. Then look for some more. It is helpful to understand languages of the past because they are being used now. But history should be exciting. It should be about discovery. It should be about finding new ideas and inspiration. And so I encourage you to think that it's not just I need to study this and it will be this set period of time. I think you should unlock your ideas and be inspired by everything.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I still invite everyone in Zoom to probably drop the question in the chat box. And while I believe I have another question. Prof, yeah. Sorry, you have to hold the slide.
Good, thank you very much. It's always interesting to hear historian telling story, the architecture. It's rich and I see there is two, what do you call it? We can use the history as the resource of development or innovation. But the other way around is try to keep it, to shut out, to form the identity. Do you think it is right now relevant to discuss about the architectural identity? In Indonesia, especially in several provinces, it was put in the building code that the building should, express their local identity, like the West Sumatra. I saw something that is awkward to put this traditional to the high-rise building, for example, and there is a problem. How do you think about the identity architecture? Or maybe you can tell about the Australian architecture. Is that?
Thank you so much, Pak Pras. So yeah, I think that's how we respond to the very strict and very prescriptive traditional architecture.
It's a really good question. So identity in architecture is it's very complex, and I have done some work, some research looking at it in the Australian context. I think identity is something that should grow from the place, but it does not mean it is a unthinking use of ideas, decorations, motifs, shapes to reference the past, because we often don't have good architecture when we do that. So we shouldn't be thinking we try and copy or appropriate, take. We should be thinking about how we create that for here and now, and what are the useful lessons from the past and the place to create new architectures that are strongly part of the soul of the place, the country. So in Australia, when we look at what has developed over the 20th century, we see a growing confidence in architecture and in design, and what makes the design of Australia. And that is a climate responsive architecture. But there's very big variation in climate in Australia, going from the very quite cool down in Tasmania, the sort of temperate, cool temperate in my state in Victoria, up into the tropics. And so what is an appropriate response will be different in Darwin to Hobart. But there are certain ways of thinking about architectural design that are becoming more Australian, and that we can see that coming through. So they don't all look like shearing sheds, or they don't all look like traditional structures by Aboriginal tribes, but they have an approach, a way of thinking about architecture that is becoming clearly Australian. And one of the things that we do is use colour in interesting ways, and materials in particular ways. If I went to New Zealand, I would see that a slightly different architecture, because it's growing from the place that it is. And when I come to Indonesia, I see architecture that is growing from the place that it is. And here on ITB, there's some amazing buildings that are beautiful, fantastic, and it's a coherent place, a whole that starts to work together. So identity is hard, but it does not need to be, you need to be thoughtful about how you express that in the architecture. And bureaucrats like making rules that tell you what you are supposed to do, but the rules are very hard to make to get good architecture. So, it's hard.
So you mean you don't suggest to use certain language of architecture that is already probably common because of the long imposition of for instance Minangkabau is Pagonjong. So that's something that we have to kind of rethink. Is that what you suggest?
I think that not necessarily rethink, but there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. I don't think there is one answer to these. There are many answers. So I'm a postmodernist. If I was a modernist, I would think there was one answer. Postmodernist, I think there are many answers. So probably I said that too fast. So the problem with rules is that it tends to come out with one or two answers, and it does not allow for the creative interpretation that leads to better outcomes and architecture that is probably more of the place in that way.
All right, thank you so much for the answer, Julie. I have one question here. Oh, probably we did first, yeah, because he raised. Oh, okay. All right, so changing plan. We have one student here. Can you hold the mic?
Hello, Prof. Thanks for the time, and to say thanks to you about the insightful presentation. And I have a question about how about the architectural vernacular, especially in Australia, that it seems that inspired by local people, indigenous people, that which seems to be starting to disappear today because yeah, we know that of the greater influence by the colonial architecture. And along with that, give us about your thought how architecture will be formed in the future. All right, thank you.
Thank you for the question. I have to go here.
So it's a very good question. So I should explain a little bit about Australian Indigenous people and their architecture. And I will say that Australia, colonial Australia, has a shameful past of treating the original First Nations peoples of Australia. Awful, okay? But there is a really strong push now to think about how we celebrate Indigenous culture in Australia. One of the things about the architecture that the Indigenous clans and nations built was that it was very lightweight and it was designed to be disassembled, taken apart, and there are records of it, but it was not permanent architecture. There are some permanent works that are observable in the colder areas of Australia, but there are very few that are around. What it means and meant at the time in which Australia was invaded by the colonial settlers is there was not a recognition that that architecture was important. They thought of it like tents, that it would come and go. It wasn't important. There was not a decorative tradition that was embedded in that architecture either. Australia is made up of over 250 language groups, Indigenous language groups, and there is not one single coherent Aboriginal culture. Oh, please. Some of that makes it quite difficult to borrow from, to appropriate. Thank you. So how do you then celebrate architectures of the place when there is not much to draw from and it is a very long way from contemporary architecture? What we can't do is just borrow different decorations and put them on buildings. That's not right. But Aboriginal people have a concept of what is called country. Country is you belong, you are born of country, so an area, and you have a responsibility to care for country. So if you are an Aboriginal person, you will have a specialty that you look after on country, and you have obligations to do certain rituals to look after that. A lot of Indigenous peoples around the world have somewhat similar ideas about caring for the land, the wildlife, and living in that ecosystem. So you can think about it in that way. So one of the things that we can think about in contemporary Australian architecture is how do we care for country? That means that if there is a waterway through a site, how do we ensure that, and for an Aboriginal person, a waterway would be a living thing. How do we ensure that living thing has the right of passage across that site and is cared for and looked after? How do we care for the bird life and to make sure that they can come and go? How do we care for the fish, the insects? How do we respond to the weather, which also is a living thing for them? How do we ensure that the seasons, and they have more than 4, they have 6, 7, 8, how do we ensure the seasons can come forth? It's not a physical response, but it is a mental way of thinking about how design can care for the land and therefore the place that it is. So it's a really amazing concept about how you think about design, that it isn't about I'm going to copy that shape or that building to become something new. Australia is very complicated in this way.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julie, for the answer. If we did want to ask question.
Thank you, Professor Willis. It's really, I do agree with you with the history, but do you have any suggestion or tips for us who doesn't like history or doesn't learn well during the history class? So how far should we explore the history of a building, for example? Thank you.
Interesting question. Yeah, I think we suffer from this problem.
Well, I think you have to ask yourself, what is your favorite building? And if anybody asks me what my favorite building is, I look at them and go, because in my head, I have 10, 15, 20 favorite buildings, and I have to work out which one is my favorite one that day. So why? What is the favorite building? Why is it your favorite building? What are the qualities about it that make it your favorite building and you want to be there or you want to see it or you want to go there? And if you're like me and you have 100 favorite buildings, what is it about all of them that make them amazing? You can tell stories about them. If you are studying history, really, I would hope that one day you see a building in which you go, wow, that's amazing. If you're not, I worry a little because architects should be inspired by architecture. They should be able to go, oh, that's amazing. I want to do something like that. So if you aren't finding buildings that are inspiring, then go and look for more till you get inspired. But when you find it, you need to look at it. You need to analyze it and think about it. Why is this so good? What can I learn from this that I can then use, not copy, use in the way I'm doing my design, my architecture? I was very inspired as a student by some of the contemporary Japanese architects, such as Tadao Ando, and the beautiful use of concrete, but light, the way the buildings had light come into them. And I tried to design things that were like this, that would be amazing, use of a hard material to create a soft environment and how you could work with that. Inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright because he used so many different geometrical systems in his architecture. And some of it's fantastic and some of it's weird. Some of it works and some of it doesn't, but he experimented and changed over the course of his career. And Le Corbusier, who I have a love-hate relationship with, I look at some of it and go, this is amazing. And then I look at it and some go, oh my God, not more of it. And some of it, no, I hate it. And then I look at his drawings. He can't draw, by the way. It's a really big inspiration. It means you can be a good architect and not be able to draw. But I like the way he reinvented, and he would keep looking for new ideas. And so I keep looking for new ideas because I can see that. I don't want to do the same. I get bored easily. That's probably the problem there. But find what you love and then analyze it, pull it apart, understand why you love it, and it will tell you a lot. And history becomes alive at that point in time.
Okay, thank you. That's a very useful tips. Yeah. Okay, and then the part that Le Corbusier cannot draw, that actually remind us that this is because so many students actually asking, especially new, coming student, is it okay to be architect if I cannot draw? answers. Yeah. Okay. I still invite questions from Zoom or here. While waiting, probably I can ask to you. I have a lot of questions. I told you. Yeah. About, for instance, I have a research now in Lombok, and in that place, as the government still developing the areas, it's quite modern. You know, like the development is modern, but then there is existing rituals there. Madek Mare, they camp on the beach for some certain times, but then after the development, it looks very dirty and look like a slum in a very modern development. So I just ask for your probably an opinion in developing an architecture, an urban design, or something. Should we actually try to enhance the existing condition, which is okay, we do it modern, and we hope that they will change their way, or we kind of like adapting of, okay, that is the existing, we try to kind of resemble it just to make everything become harmonic. Thank you.
You've asked a very complex question. So you have to be very, very careful about coming into communities and telling them what to do. Because if you tell them what to do, inevitably you do not understand all of it. And you can end up with some very bad outcomes, that the community no longer works together, that things get worse rather than better. Some of the things that are done with Indigenous communities in Australia are about ensuring that there is better hygiene. And rather than working against the community, they work with the community to do simple things. And it can be just the availability of clean water and the disposal of contaminated water in particular ways. And they're not what you would think. What they try and do is make sure that puddles are avoided so that mosquitoes and disease is less likely to breed in that situation. So they use certain techniques to create that. So then you bring the health of the community up. And they work with communities to say, well, what sort of shelters and spaces do you need? There are all sorts of religious reasons why they will abandon houses after the death of a person. They also have kinship obligations, which means that very large numbers of extended family can come and stay for long periods of time. They don't like to cook inside, so they prefer to cook outside. So you have to work with that. Instead of saying, oh, well, you need a house and the house will look like this, and you need to be grateful that you have a house that looks like this, you need to say, well, how do you live? And what do you need? And why do you go from one place to another? And is that important for the community? So how do we make community strong, and how do we have architecture that supports the community? And when new developments come in, how do they respect that community without copying it? It's a very, very difficult thing to achieve. Maybe impossible, but we can be more respectful in the way we approach this than they may have done in the 20th century.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. That's yeah, it's very complicated sometimes. It's very confusing also to deal with something. We have some certain expectation of this kind of modernity kind of thing, and then we have to deal with something that is very grassroots and low, you know, like low architecture. Like, I don't know how to say it, but I mean it's very vernacular, very yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. I invite more question. Yeah, Ibu Endang will ask question.
Okay. Hi, Julie. How are you? I think your last slide is our beautiful building. Yeah, that's challenging. And yeah, well, my question is, you know, that history shows us that we started from like slow civilization, and then it's like faster and faster, and then we have so many things that amaze us, including new building, contemporary. So how a city, for example, that we'd like to preserve old architecture, which is very expensive also, hard to maintain, and sometimes not useful too. It's just beautiful to look at it. But then, but city is like evolving as well. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe related to Pak Pras' question about identity, our city, which is like rainy and then like wet and everything, how history like embrace or merge and look the city as something that's historical. I'm not sure the question.
Thank you so much, Ibu Endang, for the question. Okay, an interesting question.
Yes, another very interesting question. I'm getting lots of hard questions today. So adaptive reuse is important for historic buildings because buildings need to be used to be cared for and loved, valued. So, and there are only so many museums that you can have. But so in Australia, good heritage practice is about the careful reuse of buildings and the adaptation of them for new uses that is respectful of the original construction, materials, style, those kinds of things. That does not mean they cannot have new architecture in them. And so we often find that we need to adaptively reuse buildings and incorporate new expectations, such as elevators or toilets. These can be added to buildings and they don't have to look like the old building, but they need to be understood as a careful, respectful intervention in a building to make it more useful. And useful buildings are the ones that survive. The Jakarta Old Town is really beautiful. And as a visitor, I would love to see inside more of those buildings, but I also would love to understand more about what this means and how it was difficult. So interpretation becomes important. So tourists want to see and understand, but they also want to understand how this might be not good. So we need to be respectful of the past. We need to be able to use the buildings. We cannot lock them up as museums. And we need to find ways of making them useful that does not destroy them. It's a difficult thing to do, but certainly in Australia, we try to reuse buildings wherever we can for useful purposes, not just art galleries and museums.
Okay, thank you for the answer. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Bu Endang. And I still invite, do we have question in the Zoom? No, yeah. Do we still have question here while waiting? Probably I can ask you again. Well, I'm still waiting for you, yeah, kalau ada, if you have any question. So, we try to find alternatives in finding precedents. For instance, we used to like very trends of you know, the precedent from the big names architects, Hadi Foster. We try to find something else that actually exists beyond those kind of star architect bubble. And if we see history, and we know very limited architecture. For instance, Borobudur, and then you mentioned about Parthenon. That's actually the key building. They're actually similar to Zaha Hadid's building, and you know, those big names architect, Sydney Opera House. How do we kind of understand also beyond those kind of story that we already know about Borobudur, about Parthenon, and how do we understand, you know, the something else beyond that?
Research. Go and find out. Go and look and investigate and uncover. Appreciate again and reinvent what the past is. When I was a student, I was very disappointed that when I studied, there was nothing about women architects. And I thought, as a woman, I would like to know whether there were women practicing. And so I went to one of my former lecturers and I said, well, I'm interested in doing a PhD. And he said, well, why don't you do women architects? And I said, well, surely it's been done before. And he went, no, there's no research on it. So we can't put it in our teaching because we do not know. I went, oh, okay, I'm going to do that. And I went away and I did a PhD looking at the history of women architects in Australia. And I wrote a book and I uncovered some amazing work. But along the way, it completely changed my idea about what practice in architecture was. And I realized that the star architect, is really rare, and that lots of people are working in practices doing good works, but because it's not the iconic building, you never learn about it. So you need to do more to understand the breadth of practice contributions and who changes the way we think about things, because sometimes the answers are surprising and they're not Zaha Hadid or Norman Foster or even Geoffrey Bauer. They could be the ordinary people doing ordinary things and then suddenly something changes. So research is my answer.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, research, okay. I keep that in mind. Okay, I still invite any more question from people. Oh, we have question in the Zoom chat box from Andrew C. Putra. Let me read it. How do you see architecture history in the client view? The client needs and budget really define the architecture also. As we currently become more individual need, as opposed to more communal needs in the past, it's really complicated to define our time now.
I think that the architect has a role in educating the client about good architecture, and that good architecture can be historic architecture as well as contemporary architecture, and to encourage them to keep things and to value them. Now, not every client will do that. But every architect can try to educate their clients. And sometimes it is better for the client to keep the old building. In Australia, some of our laws, particularly in planning, will give you can build higher if you preserve the original building. So for the developer, for the builder, this is a good thing. They can get more profit because they have to keep the historic building. Yes, they have to spend money in it, but they will make more money. So some of what we have in terms of laws really encourage that. And now it will be different here, but there is a possibility for governments to encourage this and to make it profitable for people to look after the past and care for it.
All right. Okay, thank you, Julie, for the answer for Andrew C. Putra's question. Do we still have question in Zoom or in here? Oh yeah, more question. Andrew said thank you, Julie. And then from Rijaludin, right? Pak, dari Rijaludin, from Rijaludin, because history gives us the tool to analyze and explain problems in the past, No, it's all right. Because history gives us the tools to analyze and explain problem in the past, it positions us to see patterns that might otherwise be invisible in the present, thus providing a crucial perspective for understanding current and future problems. In context, to understand future problems, what must we do to recreate old ideas into something new?
We have to think about those things. We actually need to think to articulate the ideas we find helpful from the past and to work that into how we are practicing now. It is possible to write all of this down, but then it might become another boring history book in which no one reads. So I tend not to think about writing down manifestos. I tend to think about individuals being inspired because everybody is inspired in a different way. So we can create ways of thinking about these things, but taste will change over time. So as soon as you start to articulate it, taste is still moving. So it becomes complicated to do that. So that's why I prefer the sort of free inspiration model than dictating, if I have interpreted the question correctly.
Okay, thank you. Still more question. Thank you, Rijaludin, for the question. Oh, we have from Pak Doni, Muhammad Doni Kurniawan. You said that the architectural history is supposed to inspire students to design. Usually, we only use the geometric or the form of the present building to inspire us, not doing the research behind the process of those buildings. How do you encourage students to do the proper research in terms of finding historical background on the building? Kind of pragmatic.
Well, there are different ways of doing this. You can research the background to the building and its precedents and where it sits in history and why. But I also think you can visually analyze a building and the spaces within it to think about what are the elements that create the feeling, the atmosphere of the building, and what do you want to take from that? I talked about light and materials before, and that's what I think about in my design is very much about light and the feeling of the space and layout and things like that. And I'm looking at other buildings of the past to inspire me in different ways. I think if you are only looking at photographs of buildings, you are not understanding them well. You need to be in buildings. You need to, and if you cannot be there, you need to imagine what it is like to be there based on your experience of buildings that you may have seen or been into. And you need to think, what is it that makes that special or difficult or awful or fun? And how do I think about the essential parts of that to take into my design? It might be that you love the curl of a volute and you want to use that in your design. So what does that look like in 3 dimensions? It's not just a line on a page. It is a 3-dimensional thing that has texture and materiality and temperature. You need to feel, touch, smell, see these things, and then try and think about how that your design will be received in that way. And you will do much better architecture by doing that, because you are thinking more deeply about architecture, not just as a drawing on a page or a model on a table, but a living, breathing thing that humans will occupy. And as soon as you start to think that, you will do better.
Thank you, Julie, for the answer. Thank you, Pak Doni, also for the question. Probably last chance if any of you want to raise question to Julie. If not, then probably I will ask Julie to give like a final remark to inspire us further for not being allergic to history, especially in design.
Don't be allergic to history. Go out and enjoy it and understand that history is exciting. It's fun. It can bring so much depth to what you are doing. And it doesn't have to be boring. You don't think of it as boring. Think of it as an adventure and discovery. And then you will go, history is great. History is fun.
Give round of applause to Julie. All right, so if we don't have any more questions, I have to probably end this session, wrap it up. Thank you so much, Julie, for making time to come and to deliver this beautiful lecture. I would like to remind you that this is not the last of our guest lecture series 2022. We will have Jennifer Day next week, talking about the ethics in doing quantitative and qualitative research. That's the research Julie talking about, right? So that we're gonna talk about the ethics, and then the next week on the 1st of November, we will have Anuma Pires talking about theorizing the South, meaning how to do research in global South context, because it's very specific. Okay, probably before we end this, I would like to have a photo session, but how we do it, Asep? Should we capture the one in the Zoom and then we do like a live photo here? And then use the camera to see, okay. Oh yeah, that's a good idea. All right then. So bear with me, everyone in the Zoom. We will have photo session, but we still need to kind of rearrange everything before we do it, probably within a minute. Please, Julie. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Ravi, if any of you want to be in the picture better, you want to come forward? Come on. Come on, hurry up, hurry up. We don't have much time. People are leaving from the Zoom. Julie, do you want to sit here or in the middle? No. Okay, I'm going to sit here. I'm all right. As long as Pak Asep, Pak Ojan. Sini, Bu. Masuk enggak? Can you turn on the camera, the Zoom, so we can have a good photo session with Julie Willis? It's not every day that we have here. We're here, so kind of rare chance. Enggak apa deh. Ya udah. Ini kayaknya kurang ke sana ya, Pak, kameranya. No, I mean, bagian mana nggak kelihatan? Oke, saya gini aja. Pak Fikri, kameranya kurang ke kiri tuh. Itu yang di SAPPK. Lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke. 1, 2, 3. Oke, bisa di capture yang di Zoom? Wait. Oke, siapa yang mau nge-capture? 1, 2, 3. Next page mungkin? Cuma 1. Banyak. Oke. Oh, ini nggak ada yang nyalain ya? Ya udah nggak apa, capture aja deh. 1, 2, 3. Capture 1, 2, 3. We need all the documentation, by the way. Here, 2. Okay. All right. All good? Thank you so much. Because the photo session is over, now officially wrap up this guest lecture with Julie Willis. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Also, people in the Zoom, thank you so much. So I'll see you next week in the next guest lecture. I close with Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Very well.
So inspiring. It's very ethnic kind of thing. So he used his woven rattan bag. Very pretty. Riding a bicycle with a woven rattan basket. The bag. But how does she put some flowers on it? Nah, you want to I just leave it there. Yeah. Yeah, I think I don't know. Yes, okay. Halo, kok baru datang kamu? Oh, saya pikir kamu baru datang. Then thank you so much for the help. Tadi tuh gimana sih? Emang ada yang nggak bisa di-mute gitu?
Ya tadi tuh ada yang bisa di-mute. Aku udah mute. Mungkin sana juga Pak Iti nge-mute. Jadi mute, unmute. Akhirnya Diki.
Siapa? Elisa mungkin.
Namanya?
Oh, itu
alumni kan?
Alumni.
N aja ya?
N aja. Recordingnya di sini berarti.
Hah? Pelajaran MC bahasa.
Mau dibalas atau ya?
For me, it's always a person.
Tahu. Ya, meeting ya?
Yes.